Hi, my name's Bruce D.R. Grant. Some of you might recognize me as the deep, beautiful, rich voice of War Thunder's The Shooting Range and other specials that I do for War Thunder. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about hurricanes and their role in Egypt during the war, and a little bit about a man called Douglas Ross Grant, who was a flight lieutenant, because I carry his names. He is my father. Dad. Douglas Ross Grant, as he was prior to entering college, at 15 years old, went to RAF Halton Technical College to take an apprenticeship course. He went in as a fitter, which is the very, very first, lowest level of apprenticeship. There is a memorial built on the front of the Halton grounds, which is a three-dimensional square, and the center is a cuboid hole. Each student going in, or apprentice going in, had to machine a cube that could fit exactly through the center of the hole. Dad was the only one who did it first time out of the first 40 entrances. An entrance is a group of students going in together. His aptitude was excellent for what he was going in for. He, after 4 years, graduated as a pilot officer, which meant he was commissioned as against a non-commissioned rank. The British government decided that in 1937, with, shall we say, shaky situation in Europe, put Dad into Egypt. Posting him first to Cairo, then to Abu Qir, then a couple of other places, finally being posted to Heliopolis, where he was with 208 Squadron. And his function there was to manage a team of mechanics and fitters to repair and maintain Hawker Hurricanes, Hawker Lysanders, Hawker Furies, Hawker Audaxes, and other aircraft that needed attention whilst he was on that particular base. He actually visited many, many different air bases, and this was part of the British government's ruse to stop the Italians from understanding their poor strength. Let me talk about the government. The British government was in a very poor state of affairs. Britain had been in the war since 1939. They had spent almost all the cash they had. They had the Britons in the countryside giving their metal house railings and anything metal to the government to be able to produce tanks, guns, ammunition, and this kind of thing. The Americans, they were about to join the war and didn't until 1941. Britain, by then, had become practically bankrupt. Not only that, that spares that should have been in abundant supply if Britain hadn't been so poor would have been readily available in Egypt, but most of them were sunk by the German U-boats because there wasn't the defensive capability of the British forces. There weren't Americans, don't forget. It was a very delicate thing, and Dad was sort of like using paper and glue to fix aircraft. Although many were made of paper and glue, he still didn't and couldn't use metal and didn't have the original parts. Dad was lucky in one respect. As a lad of about 15, he was messing around on a stone bridge in the countryside with his friend. He tripped and his friend pushed him over the side and he fell down 15 feet, which is about, 4.5, 5 meters, and landed in the river. Well, it wouldn't have been so bad if it had been 2 or 3 meters deep. It wasn't. It was 20 to 25 centimeters deep onto a bed of stones. The result was Dad cracked 3 ribs and his eyesight was damaged, preventing him from becoming a pilot. Most of the aircraft in Egypt weren't shot at, so they didn't suffer great deals of bullet holes and torn fabric of fuselage and wings and missing elevators. It was more a case of pilot error if something went wrong, or the occasional bullet hole, but they required maintenance. When the Hurricanes did come, they didn't come in the beginning of the war, they came a little bit later. It was the Hurricane 2Bs that Dad worked on. The aircraft was highly maneuverable, It was versatile. When its pea shooters had been upgraded, they were quite formidable themselves, but there was one weakness in the Hurricane which was really critical. The fuel tanks were immediately behind the instrument panel. Being behind that panel, the first thing they did if they were ruptured was burn incredibly quickly through the instrument panel, which was plywood, and the next thing they took down was the pilot, before anything else. Of course, all the airflow through the engine compartment. Hurricane pilots usually, if they did die, died of being burned alive. Rather than having time even to eject themselves, climb out. It wasn't ejection, it was climbing out. This was the worst case scenario. It was the downside of the Hurricane. Spitfires were modified and the fuel tanks were modified to make it safer for the pilot. The aircraft was also more powerful, shall we say superior in many aspects. It was a good aircraft. One particular story, which I think is quite incredible, really. The aircraft had crashed and it had damaged one of its three propellers on the blades of the propeller. The British government was non-effective in getting parts out to Egypt, and the aircraft would have to have been junked, just thrown away, because they didn't have any parts to fix it. So Dad decided, without any authorization or anything else, to see if he could fix it himself. He took the blade of an aircraft, it wasn't a Hurricane. He took the tip or the end of the blade, worked it down, it's made of wood, worked it down until it was exactly correct for a Hurricane, and then spliced the end that he'd reduced to a Hurricane propeller size, blade size, spliced it to the stub of the propeller blade missing on this aircraft. The result was, after working in a hangar with subdued lighting and everything gritty and really poor conditions, he succeeded in repairing the propeller blade to the point where its balance, its weight, was sufficient for the aircraft to use it and keep it. And the Hurricane took off and retained the spliced blade. When Dad left eventually, when we left in 1947, his team presented him with this memento, which is a handcrafted Hurricane miniature showing the splicing on the blade where Dad had put the tip from a different aircraft altogether onto the Hurricane blade. It's quite a memento. It's a good one. He was that good. Dad was a perfectionist in every way. As I mentioned, money was very, very poor in the wartime, particularly from Britain. America came into the war and helped sufficiently in the Mediterranean area. But this left Britain still dancing around in northern Africa, which the Americans weren't particularly interested in. They were concentrating more in the Mediterranean theatre and Italy and Germany. One of the particular cases was Dad was pressed to take 4 Hawker Audaxes, which actually is almost identical to the Fury, which is what you'll see in the video. Fury is a single-seater, Audax is a 2-seater. But other than that, the aircraft the same size, same performance, and pretty well everything else. Audax was often used for training. He had to take 4 of them from Aboukir to Ismailia. The problem was that the RT was damaged, radio transmission. So Dad had to use semaphore, hand signals, to inform the pilots of the other 3 aircraft what they were doing and where they had to go. Well, Dad, full of vim and vigor and happy to have this job to do it properly, was flailing his arms all over the place. And of course, every pilot and co-pilot or navigator had to wear a parachute. You had a seatbelt. This was an open cockpit, not a closed cockpit. You had a seatbelt, but you sit on the parachute. It's like a very uncomfortable cushion, and it feels like you've got terrible piles. But in his flailing his arms, he accidentally caught the ripcord and pulled the ripcord for his parachute. Result was the parachute immediately burst out of the bag it was in, and Dad was frantically trying to hold everything in because it would have killed him if it had got out. His three buddies in the other odd access were laughing their heads off watching this display of frantic fear being used to try and contain the parachute, which he successfully did, enough so that it didn't drag him out of the airplane. If it had dragged him out, he would have got caught on the tail. The drag would have then caused the Lysander to stall, and the pilot and he would have been killed. So sometimes it's good if you're not a pilot. On the other hand, it's not good if you don't know how to use your parachute properly. But that was Dad. He survived. One final thing about Dad, which I'd like to say. Dad was used by the Royal Air Force military as a little bit like a barrister, which means a lawyer in military terms, or in English military terms. And he was given the job of discovering who was the ringleader of the fuel theft scam which was running during his time in Egypt. It took him a year or so, but ultimately he found out it was his boss. And so he reported that to the powers that be and the top brass in UK. But because young men were being killed at a greater rate than their availability was for pilots and navigators and so on, they decided in their wisdom to allow the CEO to keep his position in Egypt, therefore being my dad's commanding officer, resulting in Dad being kept back as flight lieutenant until his career finished, however long that must be. It actually prevented promotion, which was a sick thing to do. So Dad lived out his life and retired in 1961 from the Royal Air Force as a flight lieutenant, the longest serving flight lieutenant in the Royal Air Force. Fantastically, the last 5 years of his life before he retired at 66 as it happened, Hawker Siddeley, the company that made the Hurricanes, had purchased Blackburn Aircraft, maker of the Buccaneer, the NA-39, and gave Dad the last 5 years the position of being the only Air Force representative of Hawker to the Royal Air Force. And they paid him handsomely for that. A lot of you will be able to experience that the original pilots of the wartime experienced. The only thing is you're sitting in a chair at a desk most times. But everything else, you can experience the feel almost of the surroundings, the power of the engines with what you're able to do, because the simulations are really excellent in War Thunder. The noise of the aircraft, the firing of the guns, you can practically smell the fuel and feel the G-forces as you move your aircraft round. War Thunder has done a fantastic job in recreating what brave men and women, not just from England, but from all nations of the world, experienced for their own countries at that time. It's an incredible game, and keep liking it, keep following it, keep subscribing.